Hi, I'm Brad Power, and I'm moderating today's meeting of the Prostate Cancer Lab. We have 3 agenda items, and I'm going to front load the one on feedback on Ally's presentation about CureMatch. And Brian has some feedback he got from his medical team, and there's a couple folks here, Emma and Peter, who had some feedback as well, and Ally's here, so that'll be agenda item number 1. Agenda item number 2 is to pick up where Rick left off in introducing the roadmap, decision tree guidelines that he started last meeting. And just pick that
up. There's some background.
Here, I'll mute. I just muted Said. And the third agenda item is Said, actually, on a further conversation about what he teed up with searching on public databases and getting insights for and hypotheses for prostate cancer. So that's a full agenda. I hope we'll get to all of it. We'll see. But so the first item is feedback on Ally's presentation on CureMatch. And just for those, just to remind you, 2 key features: combinations of drugs and off-label use of approved drugs were the 2 main things. I guess the third one, there was some conversation about also people being interested in clinical trials. So Brian, why don't you take us on that one?
Sure. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, so first off, Ally, thank you so much for doing the analysis on my data. I really appreciate it. And as Brad mentioned, we were able to circulate it to some of my oncologists, as well as to Emma, who's on the phone or on the call, as well as Peter. And so I just grabbed a few snippets of feedback that came in, and maybe we can kind of take these one by one. I'd love, or I can go through all of them, however you want to do it. I just love to get your feedback in terms of whether or not these are issues that you have come across, or if these are new, and what your thoughts are in terms of how to address them. So the first came in from Tanya Dorf, who is oncologist at the City of Hope, and she liked looking at the mutational analysis. She thought it was really interesting, but she questioned whether or not there was a clinical advantage to using an all-in strategy or looking at these agents sequentially. And so I'll pause there for your thoughts.
Yeah, that's actually kind of surprising to hear for somebody coming from City of Hope. But right now, it seems like this part, we don't even need to necessarily convince anybody when we deliver our reports that it's better to cover as many bases as possible of what's driving a patient's cancer for as many dozens and dozens, if not over 100 reports that we delivered where I was participating and reviewing. I haven't once met an oncologist who said, but why would we want to target all the mutations that are driving the patient's cancer as opposed to one at a time? Because I think that's more of a old age thinking that you can just target one at a time. And the evidence is pretty clear as well that when the drivers are left basically untargeted, they most often actually promote the next set of clonal expansion of those cancer cells that have the drivers that are not targeted. So the motivation to try to target as many of the markers at once as possible, it seems that that's actually well accepted, and for a good reason, because there's evidence for that. And we have evidence ourselves when it comes to CureMatch that patients that are partially matched or have a lot of mutations left unmatched and given treatments that only have little molecular basis, they don't do as well in terms of progression-free survival and overall survival. So it's not just like any kind of molecular matching is enough, like matching versus not matching. We've had several study results showing that it's the degree of matching that actually matters. So it's like, how many birds can you shoot with as few, obviously, stones being drugs as possible, matters almost incrementally, which is why we have the score. We wouldn't bother with a continuous variable for a score if it had no merit. And so since the beginning of the company in 2015, that was well before I came, but Dr. Kurzrock envisioned this coming from her clinical practice. And that's been the problem that she already set out to solve even before the industry was asking for it. And ever since those times, as much as possible, we've had clinical evidence always analyzing and reanalyzing, showing the same exact thing, that no matter what the cancer is, no matter what the data set is, the higher the matching, the better the outcomes, and the worse the matching, the worse the outcomes. So again, when we deliver our presentations, talks, reports, we never get pushback on why would you want to, address all the mutations, because nobody necessarily wants to turn a blind eye on a cancer driver and leave it untargeted if it's druggable, because it's what it's going to do is it's going to go on and drive. The only pushback that seems to exist, and that's just the factor of time we live in, and the industry, not the medical system, not necessarily being caught up, is the ability to actually get multiple drugs in an affordable way and on time for the patient. That's not like the standard way to get 3 drugs at a time. We still see a lot of times physicians would opt for 2 different drugs, but see how the patient does, and then they say, okay, then maybe I'll add another one. Or if a patient is already on the drug and responding well, then they say, okay,
hot war occurring.
So there's some serious background. Thank you. They'll say, okay, I'll keep my patient on the treatment because they're seemingly doing okay, but I'll start adding 2 other drugs, especially if the treatment they're on has some molecular basis of sensitivity, or to keep targeting with the specific type of drug. And again, our recommendations include immunotherapy, chemotherapy, and all kinds of targeted therapies that are approved. So I hope that makes sense, and I am ready to share some. There was a slide with evidence, but we're going to be publishing a whole number of publications that will show it even more, with even bigger data sets, with the latest algorithms that we have, that the higher the score, like the more markers you cover, the better patients actually do in a clinic.
Yeah. You mentioned sort of the expense of off-label drugs, which was another issue that Tanya mentioned. Do you have any data that compares this combinatorial approach with off-label drugs, and what the cost is of that approach versus, say, standard of care monotherapies?
Yeah, I'll actually send a link to an independent evaluation sort of white paper study from an independent firm that priced out, according to all of the latest information and drug content for pricing, dosing, mode of administration, and so on, priced out a number of our reports with our recommendations to show that, first of all, there are really there are choices and options that can be obtained. And the fact that there is molecular rationale, this is also in my experience, just seeing how our reports are received. What we hear is that people say, well, this is going to help me make a case. And it's still, it's like a few extra hurdles that a physician would need to jump through to get it covered or partially covered. But they do have these processes, and having the molecular rationale to say, here is a marker of sensitivity to immunotherapy. For instance, hypothetically speaking, here is a marker that is a known oncogene, and it's precisely targeted by this drug, alternatively this other drug. Because we give alternative drugs, I don't know if you noticed it, but under targeting description, there are always alternative drugs, and unless there aren't any, and it's very much case by case specific. So it needs to have the same score, which is individual for every case. it needs to have the same therapy type and the same targeting mechanism. In that case, the drugs are considered equivalents or alternatives of each other. So with all things equal, the top drug will be the one that's most widely used or approved in the indication, but there are always alternatives that are molecularly equivalent. So with these alternatives, it's very easy to see that the score can be almost the same or exactly the same, but one treatment would cost a lot more versus the other one could be more realistic. So we have this value-based model where the overall value is kind of like the score, meaning like the molecular matching and clinical value, plus the actual financial feasibility of the situation. So the value is getting the most score for the least sort of money involved. And also another important point, I think I mentioned it before, but it's an important point. When combining multiple drugs, physicians opt to start with much lower dosages. So some drugs are easy to split because they come in different, dosages already like pre-dosed. They can be split in multiple ways. They can be taken in certain regimens that allow for this lower dose, especially if it's a 3-drug combination. And with the lower dosing, even if you get 100% of what is available, it actually lasts a little bit longer. And that makes common sense, but it's not always common, as Dr. Kozrak says, that you start off a patient, especially when it's multiple drugs, you start on 1/3 of a dose roughly as a rule of thumb, but also depends on the type of drug, and then kind of titrate up as much as feasible and as much as makes sense. And if it's a 2-drug combo, start, roughly again, for the most part, like with half the dose each. And so we have this model and we have this calculator, which can be used independently for any scoring that even, let's say, some tumor board provides from, score your candidate treatments or combination therapies from 0 to 10. And once you score it, then you can see how you can make the most impact with the smallest sort of investment for the price of the drugs. And that actually leads me to another point that we show that basically per unit of time of a person's life, having 3-drug combinations and 2-drug combinations is a lot less costly and a lot less of a burden on the patient, the doctor, and the medical system than having one drug that has no molecular basis that could be an indication and could be approved, but if there's no molecular markers to suggest that this needs to be targeted, it basically has a score of 0. And in our science, it's very clear that those are the saddest sort of data points that we wish we didn't have to see. So with that, I think I will share some of these things on the white paper to show this this overall value model. And in many of the medical institutions, so again, back to City of Hope being one, centers, they have their own drug acquisition specialists, and they're basically trained to make these appeals to compel drug coverage and reimbursement. And having this molecular rationale in the report to attach, it just gets us a step closer in that direction.
That's really helpful, Ally. I'm going to try to stay on script here a little bit, but I'm going to just go off maybe just a little bit. You talked a little bit about lowering the dosage when you combine all of these, which is interesting. Have you looked at cycling, like on off, on a therapy or on a combinatorial therapy for 3 months, take a holiday for 3 months, get back on for 3 months? Do you have any data that supports that? The reason I'm asking is that we had a really interesting conversation with Bob Gattenby yesterday, who's an evolutionary biologist at the Moffitt Cancer Center in Florida. And he has spoken and written a fair bit about adaptive therapy. And when you mention, going for lower dosage, which makes sense when you're doing combinatorial drugs, it raised this question in my mind of how he approaches it, where he actually lowers dosage. He doesn't go for the kill shot, but he's cycling it on off. So have you ever used that type of regimen? Do you have any data that would support that type of approach?
No, we don't have any evidence that would support it. So maybe this is something new and emerging, but we only have evidence to show that actually the more markers you target at once, the more you should be targeting and the more you should continue targeting. And, you know, there's no other data. So everything we put in our system is extremely well curated, and it's all with the guidance of Dr. Razel Kurzrock as well. It's not like there's just some independent AI that just comes up with some spurious, you know, predictions. It's not machine learning, and it's completely based on evidence. And we just, if we don't have clinical level evidence, we don't put it in the system. That doesn't mean that there isn't some exploratory angle that we may not be covering. But we think like with coming up with novel combinations of existing drugs, that's already kind of outside the box enough, as much as the medical system is ready for nowadays. And they are more ready compared to our, you know, human longevity days, when we did have the same thing, off-label combinations being tried, but not as frequently and not as willingly. And that was like 2015, 2016. Right now, the world is different. And I think oncology is reaching this pivotal point and turning the corner to realize that precision oncology, with addressing the mutations and as many as possible, is really the way to go. But yeah, I mean, that's a great point, but we don't have any reason to believe that taking off and then cycling back on is necessarily better.
Yeah, we're gonna try to get him on to give a speech or a discussion about his approach. He did some clinical trials with abiraterone, which is what I'm on right now. And there's also a podcast that he did with Peter Attia of The Drive, and maybe we can put that in the notes from this discussion. He's a really, really interesting physician, and definitely has a different take in terms of how to approach the delivery of treatments.
Yeah, let me just address something real quick, just to get it off the table, because there isn't much discussion there to be had. So I said ahead of time, but I needed probably to stress it more or make it more clear that, you know, a priori, to set expectations, we do not include investigational compounds. So if it's a novel compound that has not been approved for anything, that drug will not be in our system as a drug, because like I said, we include known monotherapies and combination therapies, as well as novel combinations, which ends up being majority of the top matches end up being novel combinations of approved drugs. If we included novel combinations of approved and novel drugs, then that would be a bit too much novelty in clinical reports. So things like B7H3, according to what we do, we didn't miss anything. It's just that if there is a trial, that's, you know, wonderful. And we're not saying it's not a suitable option. It's just we're not going to be matching trials that are not, you know, that have some therapy that's not yet approved. So that's one point. And the second point, I don't know where this came from, but RNA not considered. We consider RNA, protein, and DNA, and we can consider it from multiple labs and multiple reports at once. And by the way, BRAF overexpression, that's RNA, it's overexpression data. So there were, I think, 5 or so expression markers. So I think that kind of speaks for itself that RNA was considered. So I'm not sure. I think it's about the same point. So RNA for the expression of B7H3, the reason B7H3 related trial wasn't considered is because we don't consider therapies that are not yet approved, but that CAR T trial or you know, whatever that was, I think that would be a separate option that does not make it into our report. So I think that was a related point, and hopefully now that clears it up.
Yeah, we had talked about that before in terms of clinical trials, and B7H3 being one of those that was identified in some RNA-seq analysis that Rick and I did with Tempus. So I think you've got that. Emma, I think you had some questions about BRAF and the target and copy number loss of FENCA with PARP inhibitors. Do you want to elaborate on anything there?
Well, I just didn't see any solid evidence that overexpressed BRAF is something that responds to treatment with a MEK inhibitor. I just couldn't find it. I mean, it sort of makes sense because it's in the pathway. That was one question. And FUNC-A, mutation, it's yeah, as it says here, it's citing me, is an inclusion criterion in some trials with drugs like PARP inhibitors or ATR, ATM inhibitors. But again, there are no good data that it really creates sensitivity to these inhibitors.
Okay, so I have, I guess, some follow-up to do. I can pull up the evidence that we have, but if there wasn't any clinical evidence, this connection would not have been made. Our system doesn't have like the freedom to make some connections. Everything is based on drug target or marker, drug sensitivity or resistance associations that are curated. When it's a direct drug target, we actually have even IC50 values play into the score. This is not the case here. This is more about the mechanism of sensitivity through, DNA damage response and the role of PARP inhibitors. And we do discriminate between, PARP inhibitors and other inhibitors and chemotherapy in general versus platinum agents. And some markers can trigger one, but not the other. So in this case, I'll just pull up whatever evidence we have on this one, but there was enough of a clinical evidence to suggest that this can be included in the system.
Yeah, well, I just couldn't find any. That's why I asked. And I actually, there's some egoistic interest on my part because I'm working with a patient who has BRAF amplification in a completely different type of cancer. And I have difficulty suggesting a MEK inhibitor for this patient. So if I will benefit if you can find the data. Thank you.
Well, sure. Okay, but in general, I think we are on the same page about the fact that, okay, if there is a molecule, we know its oncogenic role, and this oncogene is up, whether it's on RNA level or DNA level, but it's upregulated and it's suggestive of being overly functional as an oncogene. If we know how to target it, and there's any hint that targeting it actually may be beneficial, then, well, at least from what I think we've concluded over so many data sets, there's no reason not to target it. But then BRAF, if you have upregulation, you don't have to necessarily target it with MEK inhibitors. It very much depends on what else is going on. And if BRAF, let's say, were the only marker, you can use BRAF inhibitors that are very much specific to BRAF only, that inhibit and kind of suppress this oncogenic potential of this driver, driving in a constitutively active way. So you don't have to actually go through indirect MEK1/2 targeting. It depends on what else is going on. And so in this case, there was a number of options, but MEK1/2 may be an option for some patients, whereas it's not an option for other patients. And as you probably know, and others do too, MEK1/2 is a very much known hub in which a lot of the sort of pathway roads converge from downstream of growth factor receptors, downstream of many different cancer driving ligands that ultimately can, not all of them, but a lot of them do converge in MAP kinase pathway, and MEK1/2 is a target of drugs like trametinib. And that's basically the rationale, and there is no reason to not match a drug to a target. But if you don't want to target BRAF for whatever reason, a lot of times there are BRAF inhibitors that are called BRAF inhibitors and have RAF as a root of the word, like regorafenib. They actually have better IC50s for kinases other than BRAF, and they target a ton of different things. But because of how they were initially developed and marketed, they may have RAF in their name, but it doesn't mean that they're exclusively this RAF inhibitor. And what we're doing now by giving this drug is specifically targeting RAF. So the point is that, one, even BRAF inhibitors, they're not necessarily going to be just targeting BRAF, like you're putting all your bets on just this one cancer target. And secondly, even BRAF in some cases doesn't necessarily need to be targeted. It's the MEK1/2 that needs to be targeted downstream. And in some cases, you need to do both. You need to target BRAF and MEK1/2 based on the clinical evidence. There's some questions.
Saeed, did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
I just want to make a point here about what Ally mentioned. We have done many simulation on the genomics data, and all of them shows more drugs is better than less drugs. And less, it means the number. Less concentration is better than the more concentration. And even I can show you some of those simulations, even it's a simulation, but I just want to support this idea of having different type of drugs. And another point here is, this is just the gut feeling. It's not the scientific theory actually. We shouldn't go after cancer cells with all forces. We're going to create a lot of resistance because of the interaction between pathway. You are just pushing one knob to the max, and those cells is going to react the same way. And that's the reason we see the resistance, we see the side effects, all those things. But if we can manage to change a few knobs at the same time, we can make the life for those cancer cells uncomfortable. And that's to me, that's the key. That's going to be less side effects, and the less resistance because you are attacking from different points. And this, but based on the simulation, as I said, based on the simulation, I can tell you, we see more drugs and less concentration is a better choice.
So just to chime in on that, your simulation doesn't look at scenarios where you're delivering a drug, you're taking a holiday, you're redelivering. So there's sort of this on-off.
No. Yeah, it's not the spatial. No, it's not. It's not the time sensitive.
Yeah.
It's just at the same time when you change one, say you have one upregulated genes, right? You try to downregulate it, right? When you start to downregulate and increase the concentration of your drugs, the other genes is going to react, and instead of going down, they're going to go up, and all those other side effects is going to reappear. But when you start to play with the different genes at the same time, now you have a good balance, and you don't need that much amount of drug. It means, to me, as I said, just a guess. It's not. It's called a scientific guess. Having 5 drugs with 20% of concentration is better than one drug with 100% concentration.
This is fascinating. There's definitely some opportunities to look at combining knowledge from your approach and, for example, Bob Gattenby's approach. So we got to figure out how to bring him into this conversation, and we're working on that.
I want to get to Peter Kuhn before he said he had to drop off.
Yep.
And he's got some comments.
Yeah, he had the last one here, which was the risks of off-label drug use.
Yeah. Happy to take that one. So first of all, I made some comments about the risks of multi-targeting approaches, and I think it could have been after the recording already stopped. But so first of all, we do show some of the examples of combinations being used that are novel combinations. We also know that at any point in time, there are tumor boards meeting, and most of the time when tumor boards are done, the suggestions to the treating team or the treating oncologist is to try some sort of a novel combination. We're just doing this systematically and unbiasedly and trying to provide the same type of knowledge from all of the evidence in this molecular tumor board type of rationale in the form of a report. What gets given to the patient is up to the physician to judge how clinically appropriate it is, what state the patient is in, what else they're taking, what other diseases they suffer from, medical history, things that they responded to or didn't respond to. What we do is we provide the best molecular matching, and the only molecular matching that considers and scores and filters all of these novel combinations. Now, we do filter those combinations or individual drugs for which there are known non-toxic reasons not to give them. And they can be on the level of drug combination toxicity, drug mechanism combination toxicity, or they can be on the level of resistance because of some marker confers resistance to a certain drug, then no combinations with that drug will be considered. So these types of filters we already have set up, and that's something that we put a lot of actually efforts into to make sure that we curate that and stay on top of it. That doesn't mean that if there's no evidence of something being potentially harmful, then any and all combinations are completely and entirely safe. That doesn't mean that, but for whatever has even a hint of evidence that this is toxic, or there's going to be resistance or risk of hyperprogression in a patient, those types of drugs and or combinations get filtered out. So that's another just general point about toxicity. We don't have our algorithm trying to do pros and cons and weigh out risks of toxicity, because whatever is matching is based on evidence. And if there's evidence, again, to not match a certain drug or combination, then we filter it out. With this particular BRAF question, I actually spoke to Dr. Kurzrock about this because we normally don't get these kinds of questions. So when a marker has drugs, then no matter what cancer it shows up in, we don't see any evidence not to target it. And this is what Saed was saying as well, that if you have a driver, if you don't target it, you know it's going to go on and drive, especially when others are being targeted. It's almost like enhancing the chances of hyperprogression, or that the cancer will stick to the only mechanism that allows it to thrive that hasn't yet been suppressed by drugs. So if BRAF is upregulated and it's druggable, there hasn't been any evidence, even that reference, it's actually been proven many times that it's not really the case. And that assumption is I think it's from old days and it's kind of false. So we don't see it as a cautionary tale at all. And I mean, I can forward your question to Dr. Kurzrock if she has the time, but I did speak to her and she ran clinical trials. She led the clinical trial department at MD Anderson, and she actually worked on BRAF inhibitors. The reason that sometimes it looks like there's a BRAF inhibitor or some other inhibitor that does not work, it's not because, it works and inhibits BRAF in one cancer, but it doesn't inhibit BRAF in another cancer. It's because there's other molecular contexts that could be very prevalent for another cancer type. And if you don't target those other targets and you just target BRAF, then those other targets take over. So it seems like there is a really bad outcome, when actually the reason is not because you targeted BRAF, it's because you didn't take the other parts of the molecular picture into account. So that's basically about this one. And with our results, our survival outcomes would not be so significant if combinations were so bad, because a lot of the top matches are combinations and most of them are novel combinations. And we see that those are clearly related to better progression-free survival and overall survival. And then final point, there are about 80,000 patients studied across multiple clinical trials, phase 1 mainly, that show there is no significant difference between adverse events being in association with combinations tried in a trial versus monotherapies. So this idea of having, the combinations, I'm going back to the previous point, the idea that combinations are just bad or toxic, it's becoming more and more outdated, and it's for a reason that I think in oncology, chemotherapy was really leading the way, radiation therapy, and those are really harsh therapies. And so when you think of combinations, there's this, risk aversion, but we're talking about mainly combining targeted therapies or combining targeted therapies with one chemotherapy or with one immunotherapy, not layering multiple chemotherapy, cytotoxic drugs. So again, it's more about taking the whole picture into account. And that's the reason why there was that incident of BRAF being inhibited yet not really working for colon cancer. What we show is that if you have a marker and you can drug it, it should be almost medically negligible not to at least consider drugging it.
Thank you, Ally. Brad, I'm going to be mindful of time.
I
Do we have
just
time
want
for
to add
questions?
one point, if I may.
Mhm.
Is that okay?
Go.
Yeah. You know, we know there is very important aspect of working with the genes. We know upregulated gene, downregulated gene. We know the driver and passenger. If we take care of driver gene, passenger genes, they're going to follow. But there is one and another aspect of about this is that upregulated, downregulated is offensive or defensive? This is a point. It means if we see something upregulated, is because something bad is happening and they are pushing that gene to be upregulated. Then we need to downregulate it. How about if that upregulation is the defensive part in our system? It means this.
Oh, is it just me or Sayed froze right now?
No, he's frozen to me as well.
Once he comes back and completes his thought, I think I have something to echo that a little bit.
He's circling the dark side of the moon.
So you know how I'll repeat this once he
I
comes
had
back
to.
around. So like some of the co-occurring pathways that get, instigated by certain cancers and drugs can be involving growth factor receptors. So for instance, Pembro, if there's any co-expression with EGFR, then pembrolizumab and analogous checkpoint inhibitor focusing drugs cannot be given without EGFR inhibitors. So if you just think, well, there's a marker, PD-L1 or tumor mutation burden, so we're going to give Pembro, and you think you're addressing the marker, but there are rules, very specific rules based on clinical evidence that even if, let's say, EGFR upregulation is a secondary, like a passenger, or it's an outcome of something that happened earlier in the cancer evolution, even if it's not the main root cause driver, but if it's there, it needs to be addressed, because there is clinical evidence that if you don't in such cases and you give Pembro without EGFR inhibition, then it leads to hyperprogression, which is really scary. Now, those are cautionary tales. You need to address all the markers with all of the knowledge. But I think that kind of echoes what Sayed was saying. So I'm trying to fill in this pause with relevant information, hopefully, but hope he comes back.
Okay, so there were two other hands raised. Nick, you had raised your hand, please.
Yeah, so Ally, very interesting stuff. Good to hear your voice. One question I had, and I put it in the chat, and I think you saw it, had to do with these novel combinations and the kind of dose finding exercise that one would have to go through. And does CureMatch kind of provide a recipe for how to do this? Because you could imagine not wanting to give someone drugs that aren't effective, right? But you got to start somewhere with these novel combinations in order not to kind of create a toxic situation. So on what basis would a physician, based on your criteria, decide when to ramp up or ramp down doses in these novel combinations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I refer to it verbally, and sometimes that gets brought up, and I only refer to it anecdotally, deferring to Dr. Kurzrock's and others' feedback and their clinical expertise. And they've used, 4 drug combinations that were novel, just starting at lower dose. But in our product, we don't actually give any kind of a recipe, because this gets into the doctoring space, which we try to stay out of. We do the molecular matching, and then we can say, there's a page in there that shows here published examples with those dosage strategies where people can read about it. Some of these examples have Dr. Kurzrock actually as a co-author. So that's as much as we ventured into that space to provide published references so people can be aware of it. But for physicians, it's for them to decide how low they start from the beginning and how they up the dosage for how many drugs. Each drug has to have evidence. Without proven evidence and being approved as individually, each drug approved as safe enough, that wouldn't go into the combinations. But the novelty of combinations is that even if both drugs or 3 drugs are on label, but the combination hasn't been tried as such, then it's considered a novel combination. Now, if it is in clinical trials, we do provide those relevant trials that in a way serve as evidence, but we don't go too far into saying, give your patient this and this, because that's making final recommendations.
Oh,
and
I know. I was just thinking for someone who isn't, say, as experienced as Rizal, but who's been giving advice through CureMatch to start out with these drugs. I mean, they may not be experienced in monitoring outcomes the way, say, Rizal is. So without some, I used recipe, without some understanding of how one could adjust the dosages, it just might get complicated, especially without like a protocol that someone could follow.
Yeah. So the best we do is provide those references. They're part of the report and people can read them. It's about, dosage combination strategies. And then we do review reports. We offer report review. And so far we've been able to do it anytime somebody wants to take us up on that offer. And during a conversation, we can say, well, it's been often used like this, or I know of cases when, so we can speak of it referring to somebody's clinical experience, but we don't put it in that report. So it doesn't mean that we leave people like high and dry. We do provide guidance if we're asked.
Okay, two more comments in the chat. John Laird, Dr. Laird, did you want to bring anything forward?
No, I think I have it in the chat. Our guidelines are consistently driving cancers to resistance, and this is not being addressed with all of the resources that are available. I think Saed is bringing some valuable points. Bringing in Dr. Gattenby is hugely important in finding the resources that are available in this country to put what he's talking about into effect. The science is clear, and our oncologists are consistently telling people your cancers aren't cured, or incurable, excuse me, and we're going to continue using this strategy that we know are not curable. We might give you some, some increased months or a few years. We just need to name it for what it is, and Gattenby's got some great perspectives. And I have to step off just because I have a consult coming up. But this is a great discussion. I put in the chat the resource, one of the resources Brian was referring to.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
And Jeff Waldron wanted to comment about expanded access.
Yeah, I just put in the chat too, but I've preached on this before, but I think with patients with advanced disease, as we're discussing in most of these calls, probably they won't qualify for clinical trials. So I think expanded, I know they're not part of the CureMatch AI engine, but I think expanded access programs can give patients access at no cost to investigational therapies. So it really becomes, without the AI tools that Ally is talking about, you have to rely on your clinicians at academic medical centers to make the recommendation for a therapy, given that it's investigational and the trials are underway, but they're usually in stage 2 or stage 3 trials at that point. So the dosing is fairly established. It's more efficacy they're working on, I think. So I think it's something patients should consider. And there's been a huge increase in EAP programs in the last 18 months. And the FDA, and particularly oncology, has the Reagan-Udall system that steers cancer patients to EAP therapies.
Okay. Saed, you're back.
Yeah, sorry, I lost the internet connection.
So you were completing a point, and then you also had something else that you wanted to share with us. And I'm conscious we're, as often as the case, the discussion is filled up our time. So if you could sort of take us home here, and we'll have to, Brian and Rick will have to come back to the roadmap guidelines discussion in our next meeting.
Right. I just want to, my point was, I'm going to quickly repeat the same thing. We know about the upregulated and downregulated genes. We know about the driver and passenger. If you take off the driver gene, passenger genes, they're going to just follow. But another point, another aspect is the upregulated, downregulated is the offensive or defensive. And it means some bad things happen and they are pushing some gene to go toward upregulation, then we need to downregulate them. But how about if our system is trying to upregulate for a defense, then we cannot downregulate them. This is going to add another dimension to the whole complexity of this interaction between genes and diseases. I just want to do it. And I need just 5 minutes to share my finding related to the that chart, flow chart. Actually, I really like that flow chart. Is that okay? Can I share something quickly? And
Yes, please.
okay,
And I do have a meeting at 10, so if there is nothing more for me, I just want to say bye ahead of time, not to interrupt later.
Thanks, Ally. I
Thank
think
you.
we covered it. Thank you
Thanks
very
again,
much.
Ally. I appreciate your time and help.
My
Yeah,
pleasure.
Ally, it's Rick. I wanted to mention that Ally kindly offered to do an analysis on my data as well, but the data that Ally took to come up with her CureMatch report for Brian was dependent on about 3 mutations and about 5 noted overexpressions. I got the same CureMatch, I got the same Tempest report, but my Tempest report only noted about 3 mutations. It did not note the 5 overexpressions. And Ally responded, I can't really, work with such a sparse input. And so it really goes to show what is getting reported and what CureMatch can do is it's dependent on the input and it's inconsistent. And I wanted to mention that I will try to fish out or revisit so you could address my data as well. And I thank you. And I just wanted to note that.
Yeah, if there's only one mutation, and maybe there's one other mutation, but the one mutation, like the fusion, is not even targetable, then sometimes there isn't enough input in the report for us to even bother doing a CureMatch report. It's like if there's nothing to CureMatch, we just say, look, if you have this one marker and you already know how to target, let's say, androgen receptor, and the fusion is not targetable, you don't need CureMatch to go and score that. I mean, we can do it, but it won't be valuable, which is why I offered to look at your expression data, which you do have, but at that time I think it wasn't ready. We don't have the ones that are truly kind of the main markers. And let's do it, let's look at it and see what the whole picture tells us, and maybe there is something to put in and have some value out of the CureMatch report for that case.
Thanks. Saeed?
Yeah, okay, thank you. First, I really like this chart, that this is great. Hopefully we can make this one dynamic. And another layer after making it dynamic is moving from descriptive and exploration to prediction. For example, when we start this one from prostate remove, the first thing I asked was this one. Can we predict recurrence, right? Somebody, they have prostate removed and we want to know if we can predict this one. Because it's going to change the approach, right? This is going to be important to us. Then we created an app. We search on the public domain data. We search for prostate and recurrence, and we found 17 public domain experiment related to this too. We chose one of them, 26022, which is related to the recurrence of the prostate cancer following radical prostatectomy. And then we analyzed this data, and we found only one gene, RCC1, can be a very good predictor of recurrence. Okay, now at this stage, we can pass this one to the clinical researcher, right?
What is this gene? What is this gene expression?
This RCC is amazing. Is upregulating the recurrence cases is one of the, when you search on the internet, the multifaceted roles of the RCC1 in the tumorigenesis. Now you see this guy, I didn't know that. When we analyzed him, we didn't have any clue. But when we found this one, we saw this many paper related the relationship of this gene with the tumorigenesis. And then at this point, we need to say, guys, this is something, go after this one. Maybe this one can be a biomarker to predict the recurrence. And that's going to completely change the way we can manage the patient, right?
Why did this gene appear? Was it overregulated? Was it upregulated? Was it, how was this determined? Was it in transcripts per million?
That's the one issue of having a group of patients in this experiment and single gene, a single patient, right? Because you need to compare if this is more than the normal, right? What is normal for one patient? We need to this is the question mark, right? It means we need to solve this issue. But as a two groups of patients, we can easily say this is with recurrence, this is not recurrent, and then we can compare them. But that's a very good question. How do we know if this has been upregulated, for example, in your case, right? This is something we need to work on it. But at least based on this experiment, we know this is a signal we have. But we, as I said, we need to answer those questions, what you just mentioned.
So this, go ahead.
Sorry. RCC is actually involved in, is kind of a marker of progression in more than just prostate cancer. It's a protein that regulates chromatin condensation. That's an important step in cell proliferation. I'm not sure that it's either targetable or useful. You know, a lot of proteins.
Oh, no, as a biomarker, it means can we
As a biomarker,
use
yes.
it for the probability of recurrence?
Yeah.
So this patient, now why I'm saying this one, because when we look at this data, we saw this one, doxorubicin and the ATRA, these two is going to downregulate that upregulated gene, 10 upregulated gene in the out of 14 upregulated gene. Now we can ask this question.
They are cytotoxic or cytostatic maybe agents. It depends on circumstances. So of course they will downregulate RCC1 because if cells stop dividing.
But how do you know this is specific? No, you can. I can show you many other drugs which they don't do that. The chemical. No, this is not true. Okay. Actually, I can tell you. I can show you a big list of the drugs which they don't. But this is a point. Actually, the point here is, if this is true, again, this is just the hypothesis. This is true for those patients which they are positive regarding that RCC1 biomarkers, maybe after that surgery, they need to take these drugs. Maybe that can affect the rate of recurrence. This is all hypothesis, okay? That's something. And that was my message today.
Thank you, Said.
Okay.
I'm sure Brian and Rick, who joined, the conversation with Bob Gattenby, will see in this the importance of the multidimensionality of the crowd that we've assembled here. Because what Bob Gattenby said is, I want mathematical models and simulations that will in advance predict what's going to happen if I give this combination of drugs. So it's sort of like you need CureMatch to suggest a combination of drugs, then you need a dosing strategy, et cetera. But then you also need a simulation model that predicts what's going to happen and then see if it pans out. And the hypotheses that are underlying the strategies that clinicians are using are not explicit. And what I think Said has said very directly, Bob Gattenby also said, and Dr. Laird pointed out, is the underlying strategy, the underlying principle is hit the cancer with a maximum tolerable dose until you get resistance, right? That's what they're doing, and yet nobody kind of says it. It's not in the NCCN guidelines. So we've identified that there's this other layer that's a strategy that sits on top of the NCCN guidelines and that requires the sophistication of simulation models that Said is talking about, predictions, running experiments, and then figuring out what's working and what isn't. So we've got a whole new frontier that's opened up based on the conversation we've had today and reinforced with what we talked about with Bob Gattenby.
And I just want to add one thing. It's a great idea, you having those flowchart, and it's going to be a great help for the other patients because we can pinpoint, make it dynamic. Then we can, for every decision, we're going to ask question. Why this branch? Why that branch? Can we predict? We cannot just go for the description. We need to predict which path is a better path, and we need a prediction model.
And the other thing we then talked about with Ryan Graff yesterday of Foundation Medicine, could you predict with confidence? Could you introduce your confidence level in those predictions? So I think again, we're saying the same thing, Said. It's overlaying, well, there's a fork in the road and here's where you go. How much confidence do we have in that? How much can we predict effectiveness? And if we could do that, then the learning would be much more, you would have to track longitudinally. Does a molecular tumor board then track longitudinally what the results are and the outcomes? So learning happens when you set up experiments and you predict results, and then you either get them or you don't. And so if we want to have a thorough learning system around progressing the state of the art, we need a lot more math and we need a lot more bioinformatics. And it's going to get a lot more complicated too, because we were talking about dosing today. And to me, Brian kept asking questions about on-off. That's part of this too. And so each patient starts to look more and more like N of 1. We're going to have to get comfortable with very N of 1 kind of art, as opposed to following a regimented batch, consistent approach. Anyway, so we've uncovered a lot today. I'm going to wrap up the recording now.